Jared Bartle from the Bridge of Hope Innocence Initiative, here with Dr. Michelle Reuters, who's the director of BOHII, and a very special guest. We have Dr. Chris Brook with us, an astrophysicist with an interest in, I guess, forensic science or issues and misuse of science within the criminal justice system. So thank you, Chris, for joining us.
I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah. So I think one of the first things that I guess our audience would probably want to know is you're an astrophysicist.
Yeah.
Why are you interested in kind of wrongful conviction?
Doing here?
Yeah.
Exactly. So, well, actually started, I've got a law degree, so I started in the law and I moved and have a career in science now.
Yeah.
And I guess I started at some point, I got interested firstly in the Robert Farquharson case.
Yeah.
So I've read a couple of books about it, like Helen Garner's book, and there's another book by Megan Norris. And I could see this, especially the description of the accident reconstruction science, science in inverted commas. And I could see that there's something seriously wrong with that because it comes within my field more or less. So I've done simulations of, I do simulations of galaxies. This was simulations of a car, and it's the same principle of putting in the physics into a computer model and trying to model what's going to happen. And I could see that they really made a mess of this.
Well, so you mentioned the Farquharson case. You've written a book on the Farquharson case.
So I ended up following all that through. Yeah. At first, I just wanted to see if I was correct and that there was something wrong, or if it was just the description of the evidence was poor. And so I contacted the barrister and I got the transcripts first, and I went through and I could see, this really wasn't good science at all. It's not science at all. So
I think most people would know. So Robert Farquharson was convicted of killing his children. Very infamously, was the prosecution narrative was that he drove the car deliberately into a lake in order to drown his children. He has always maintained that he had a coughing incident which resulted in him losing consciousness. I suppose you've written a whole book on this, so this is very...
And so one of the central pieces of evidence against him was that an accident reconstruction expert claimed that he could tell from the markings on the ground and in the grass that Farquharson had steered the car 3 times.
Yeah.
And that showed that he hadn't had a coughing fit, that he hadn't collapsed, and that he was in control of the vehicle. And each one of those turns was based on very shoddy, dodgy grounds. And so, so that's what started me on the journey, really. And once I sort of knocked that piece of evidence over, I thought, well, okay, so what's the other evidence? And the next one was I got started looking at the Cobb-Singerby evidence, which was a respiratory doctor from Monash University gave his opinion that it was extremely unlikely that Farquharson would have had a coughing fit and had this condition called Cobb-Singerby. And again, that evidence looked very, very shaky as well.
And there's been subsequent experts that have come out, haven't they? And they've criticised that whole idea.
So now there's a bunch of, at least 3 cough experts in that field, or 4, have said, you just can't rule that out. And it's clearly Farquharson had the possibility that he could have had that condition, especially given his stature, his physical attributes.
What do you see as kind of the distinction between the kind of work that you do as an astrophysicist, where you're publishing research, you're kind of doing that open inquiry, and the kind of stuff that's being done in expert evidence? Like, what's the big difference?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think there's a lot of training to become a science, so there's a lot of culture involved. So in science, there's a long training period. So you do your undergraduate degree, but you haven't really trained to be a scientist until you do your PhD. I like talking about it like a trade. You go and learn some of the theory, but then you have to go and actually learn how to actually fix a plumbing, or you have to go and do it. Get your hands dirty. So this is part of the training to actually become a scientist and understand the culture, understand what type of methodology and how you question things. And this, and it's not just me saying this. This is quite well established in studies and in people who have looked at this. There's a different culture in forensic science. which is built up around the legal system rather than around a scientific sort of culture and scientific methods. So their idea is to, and a lot of forensic science, almost all of them, were developed originally by police officers just in the field, saying we want to find some evidence, and how can we use this evidence? So then they started saying, well, we could get this hair fibre that was left here. Maybe we can just look under a microscope and compare it to the accused and see if that matches, right? So this whole area of, for example, hair fibre analysis just developed in that manner. It wasn't, okay, here's a scientific field of comparing hair fibres. We're going to bring that scientific field over to the legal system. It was police finding a hair fibre and saying, well, maybe I'll look it under a microscope and see if I can compare it to an accused person. And that whole field just mushroomed. Once it was accepted in the courts, it became a field of forensic analysis, forensic science it's called, but it really wasn't scientific at all.
And there's often criticism of the use of kind of junk science, or kind of science that is not, reliable or valid for those types of techniques. And Michelle, I know we're talking about forensic evidence where the expert opinion is being given, but we've done research, and I know you have an interest in investigators kind of using junk sciencey type techniques as part of their work.
Yeah, our concern is that using junk science to, I guess, orient an investigation can completely send it down a one-track path. That this is the suspect.
So things like SCAN, which is the big one.
Scientific content analysis, which is where police and other investigators try to determine whether or not someone's telling a lie or not, whether or not they're credible. Use of polygraph evidence, to confirm that suspicion. And then, yes, this is our suspect. And then, as Chris has written about in his book, there starts the whole tunnel vision enterprise.
And it kind of, they play against each other as well, because, something like a lie detection test isn't necessarily going to get into the trial because of evidence rules and things like that. But they shape the investigation, and then they can rely on these other possibly quite dodgy techniques to argue for a particular a case or a particular point.
Exactly. Once the police make up their mind and they start looking for evidence that can help them in court to prove their case.
Mm. I know another area that you have an interest in is kind of shaken baby syndrome, or this idea of shaken baby syndrome, where a forensic pathologist looks for, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, is it a triad of features? A kind of notable set of physical features of an infant, which are said to distinguish kind of violent, homicidal kind of act versus an accidental death. So if you want to...
so this is another field where sort of, again, it wasn't created by scientists, it was created by some medical people in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And if they see certain signs, the most important one really is extensive retinal hemorrhages. There's what they call a constellation of findings. So if they find various findings together, then they say this has to be abusive trauma. It has to be abusive head trauma. And a lot of it just doesn't make any sense. For example, how can you tell the difference between an abusive head trauma and an accidental head trauma? Just thinking about it like that doesn't seem to make any sense, that you can tell just by looking in the brain that there was trauma. How do you know it was deliberate or an accident? There's also medical conditions which can cause these same findings. So it's very, very difficult field, but the basis that they're setting themselves is based on just it lacks a scientific basis. There's no real science to it.
A lot of this seems to be a kind of lack of acceptance in the uncertainty of evidence, because they know that obviously a jury, if they understood the true uncertainties of all these types of evidence, they're probably less likely to convict. There's techniques and disciplines and things like that that give this facade of certainty when they're possibly
It's an important issue. I mean, the amount of uncertainty in these diagnoses that they have and the error rates. I mean, we don't know how often this is misdiagnosed. I mean, in other fields we know of medicine, we know how often misdiagnoses are made because we have tests. So, for example, if I want to go and say, okay, let's look at a mole and see how it's changed and diagnose whether this is skin cancer or not, right? We can say, okay, just by looking at the changes in the mole, we can make a diagnosis. How often do we get that right? We can test it because we can go and do a biopsy.
Yeah.
So we know we get it right 80% of the time.
Yeah.
Between 50 and 80% of the time. But in these cases of shaken baby syndrome, they say, okay, I can look into the brain and I can tell whether it was abusive head trauma. How do we test for that to see how often that's accurate? There's no test.
Well,
so I've got no idea.
Often it's, well, they were convicted, so therefore it's correct.
That's the main test. That's exactly right. So they get, once they start getting convictions and they start getting accepted in court, then exactly the thing becomes in the medical community an epidemic because all these people are getting, hurting their baby, and we've got to stop them. So then it spreads and spreads this way of convicting. So that's what it's become, basically.
Michelle, in terms of the kind of work that we do, if there has been a conviction that's based on kind of dodgy science or a dodgy investigative technique or something like that, what are the options for somebody to try and overturn that conviction?
Well, it depends on what stage of the process they're at. So in most states in Australia now, people have first and second and further rights of appeal.
Yeah.
But the options it becomes harder to the barrier, the criteria becomes more stringent as you move through.
Yeah.
Obviously. So for a second appeal, they'll need fresh and compelling evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that scientific evidence will have to be fresh.
And I suppose if the scientific evidence is not evolving, if we're not double checking or critiquing these forensic techniques, then unfortunately that's not going to result in any kind of fresh evidence that leads to an appeal.
I mean, your best chance is really at trial the first time to get really good defence experts in your field, but that doesn't happen very much, and especially in shaken baby syndrome, where there's no medical doctors who are prepared to go against what the establishment medical doctors are saying. The prosecution medical doctors, it's very hard to find anyone who would go up against them.
I think there's a huge issue as well with, I guess, the legal profession not having the level of education in order to actually critique expertise. So before I became a lawyer, I did an undergrad in forensic science, so I kind of had that advantage going into my law degree, but there's nothing in law school that's teaching you how to critique forensic science, the limitations of forensic science. And so I think defense lawyers are kind of in a bit of an awkward position if they don't do some further education or try and get to or understand the limitations of these techniques.
I mean, I see case after case where, really bad forensic medicine is given in shaken baby syndrome, for example.
Yeah.
And the defense doesn't call its own lawyers or even question that there was abusive head trauma occurred. Their only defense will be, okay, someone injured this child, but it was, wasn't the mother, it was the father. Or if they're defending the father, it wasn't the father, it was the mother.
Yeah.
Or the uncle was there as well. Maybe the uncle did it. And that's it. Yeah. That's their defense, basically. And that usually doesn't work.
So I guess from your perspective, looking at all the issues that you've identified, just coming up with a silver bullet solution for everything. What is the solution for these sorts of issues?
It's extremely difficult because it's extremely difficult. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot.
Yeah.
My central solution, one thing is some of these institutes that we've created that do forensic science, I think we need to have as part of those institutes at least one person who's absolutely expert in evidence-based. For example, in these forensic medical institutes, should be an expert in evidence-based medicine and scientific method who has experience in sort of, for example, testing drugs to see if they're ready to go on the market. So look at the tests that have been done on drugs before they're put into our system. So there are people with that particular expertise, and I think these institutes need someone like that as part of the institute to really audit what they're doing, audit their methods. So these are the forensic techniques we use. Someone can come in and say, okay, are they based in science or not?
It sounds very similar to, so we often talk about things like conviction integrity units within kind of law enforcement and prosecutions, where there is someone's job literally to just double check the work that's been done and note any of the red flags. So you think that within the forensic,
absolutely, and just a person who's expertise in that, and even if it was just a more broad position, like a single position in the government, but someone going through the different forensic science institutes, just auditing okay, what methods do they use in lie detection, right? Is that based on anything? Should we allow it in courts?
Yeah.
That's my current thinking at the moment. I'm sure there's problems with that, but that's
I think
the solution that I've been thinking about.
That gels very well with a lot of stuff that we think about. Of I mean, we talked already about the limits of that post, like the appeal processes, and we've got the CCRC model that can also be proposed as well. But we are big believers in kind of prevention as opposed to kind of just increasing appellate options. And I think that sounds like a very good preventative type measure. Michelle, did you have any other thoughts in terms of forensic science?
No, but it's I guess every time there's a new advance, there's new knowledge, or new insight. It's always for that case. No one goes back, and no one takes that new insight and says, "Well, let's review the 20 decisions that were based on that earlier, that earlier medical scientific understanding," and that's a problem.
Yes, there's so many inconsistent results and inconsistent cases of having similar findings, but one person charged, one person not charged, one person guilty, one person not guilty. It's a complete mess. And it's partly because of that as well. Historic ones might be found guilty on the same evidence that recent ones are now found not guilty or not even charged because we've developed more understanding, and they don't go back and say, "Well, sorry."
Yeah, even in cases where there's, so for example, in South Australia, where a medical examiner was found to be less than satisfactory, and I don't think any of the previous decisions have been reviewed other than the one that was successful on appeal.
So you've raised some great points. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a simple solution to these sorts of things, but it's really interesting to get I guess I was going to say an established scientist looking at these issues as opposed to just purely a forensic science perspective, because I think it does give a very different perspective on the risks associated with wrongful convictions. So thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Great. Keep up the good work.